get that off eventually. I then need to get the stream here somewhere. Hang on. So that's that. I'll log in there. Your channel. So the live stream is here. So if I then send that over to you by email, is easier.
Where is that one? Was it very public?
No, it's on my YouTube channel.
Okay, then I'll actually do that instead because my email is a bit weird.
Okay, so if you just find. So that's that. That's fine.
Nej, jag tänkte mer för er skull. Ni får jättegärna plocka på det, men sen sitter ni med antar jag. Det är ett seminarium, en föreläsning.
Det är ett snack mellan John Worthy, en av Europas eller EUs största personer inom Twitter och så vidare.
Ja.
Så han har liksom utifrån en del
Well, I'll confirm that we're not drinking wine. So I'll say that on the stream, it's fine. Right. And then I need here. I will say for the sake of the people on the live stream, this is not wine we're drinking here. It might be a wine glass, but it's actually rhubarb and tea. On a day directly underneath the YouTube film, or if you tweet the questions using #crossborderrail, then I will get those.
Yes.
If they're on the Facebook event here in the room, we'll keep an eye on it if there's questions on the Facebook event as well, right? But basically, the questions for anyone on the
You're at the Brufu premises. But John,
right.
Tell us about your project.
Yes, and sorry that we're doing this in English. Jag talar lite svenska, but not enough to give a presentation in Swedish, and also then in German as well. So it's kind of going to be a bit of a mixture of different languages. So this is Canfranc, a very famous cross-border station in the French-Spanish Pyrenees. But a line that doesn't work through the Pyrenees. Bridge there is Sweden, so that's Haparanda on the other side of the bridge there. And you can see here the tracks are rather unusual. It's dual gauge railway lines here in this particular photo because the gauge of the tracks on the Finnish side is different than on the Swedish side, so they put the two together here to allow the trains to cross this particular bridge. What is the problem? National structure is often at the border not of a good quality. Service levels are lower, trying to get a ticket, some practical solutions. So another drone photograph at the border, Poland on that side, Germany on this side, the border between Zgorzelec in Poland and Görlitz in Germany. The bridge, this time put up the overhead electrification wires. Anyway, what was then the project? The project was to cross all of the internal borders of the European Union and Norway and Switzerland, simply because they were quite easy to add, that you can cross by train in one journey. Where there are no trains anymore, cross the border by bicycle. So there are a number of places where trains don't run for whatever reason. I had a folding bicycle with me. Particular problem for trains in Sweden, right? If you want to take a bicycle with you on a high-speed train in Sweden, went so wrong there that I had to skip the meeting. Now, the one in the background there is at the border of Netherlands and Germany, actually. In other places, tracks exist, but passenger trains don't run. That's exactly what you've got at Haparanda Tornio at the Sweden-Finland border. Freight trains run there, but passenger trains don't. The third category, which might sound a bit absurd, trains run, but the timetables are so bad that no one can use them. And the fourth is there are problems with information. At least in the Nordic countries, those are the routes took, not necessarily the most logical routes, particularly through Sweden as a result of quite a lot of building works going on the Swedish lines. And my time when crossing Sweden was slightly schizophrenic. I had both the worst and the best experiences of the entire project were in Sweden. Planning the route was really in terms of the comfort, decent onboard Wi-Fi, good coffee. Like, this was actually really a pleasure to take the trains in that part of Sweden. The difficulty, however, is I had to use buses far too often crossing Sweden due to the engineering works, which due to a top 20 projects that I am then proposing that the European Union, what I learnt and what I encountered. So first of all, the only one which was particularly interesting, where a line had fallen into disrepair and maybe could be rebuilt, is at the border here between Mons in Belgium. This purple line is the border, and this is what it looks like on the Belgian side of the border. Its agency for railways is based in Valenciennes, and it has no railway to get its people to Brussels, which is where the decisions are made. So crazy though this is, right? Loads of them basically drive, right? So this is the German-French border, where a bridge was blown up at the end of World War II, near to Freiburg in Baden-Württemberg towards France. And indeed, it will cost millions to manage to reactivate the railway lines in those places. So ultimately, in the top 20 old lines which are out of use, only one of them made the cut, because these are generally really difficult to fix. Now then, much more interesting are borders where the line is officially active, but no trains are running. All right? So why are you maintaining a track if you're not running anything there, you might be asking. I ask myself the same question. An example here is at the border between Croatia and Slovenia, right, at the town of Medlika in Slovenia, crossing to Bubnjac, here at the border, right? We've missed the 10:36 train by 5 minutes, right? The next train goes 25 minutes later. Maybe that's not so bad, right? So we miss that one, we take the 11:06, okay? What happens when we get to Ventimiglia? Oh sod, we've missed the 11:57 train by 4 minutes, and the next one is 2 hours earlier on that route. Right, now, moving one or other train by 5 minutes or 10 minutes, right? Now what has happened here is basically the timetable authority on both sides of the border, lots of regional railways in Italy have from Trenitalia, and said, are you, but both timetable authorities sitting down with each other on both sides of the border and Riga, right? So there is massive potential, which makes me most frustrated in the entirety of Europe. It would be the French-Spanish border, because the infrastructure is really good, but the train service generally is nowhere near as good as it could be. So just to illustrate the point, 3 of the there are trains that cross, it should route you here, right? But it doesn't, because they haven't got the data for that cross-border train. So the SNCF route you via Barcelona, which is here, right? As a result of the missing data, right? Now, if you literally try and do it, right, that's for the Atlantic coast border. You ask Deutsche Bahn, German Railways, which has got a good timetable, can you route me to Bilbao from Paris? And Deutsche Bahn says, computer says no, basically. It doesn't even give you a connection. Whereas actually, if you look at the data on the local website of the so-called Eusko train that runs across that border, there is a train across that border every half an hour, right? In actual quality of train service, it's one of the best borders going, but in terms of the data provision, it's totally lousy.
I took that train this summer, actually.
Right, yeah, and it works very well.
Fantastic,
Yeah, right. Now, so what we've got to work through, right, is before we even come to talking about building new tracks, right, this should be dead simple to solve, right? Now, that's one of the things then I'm trying to push legislatively or via the EU Agency for Railways to potentially try to fix. Right, another one, particularly that affects Germany, to manage to do the project, but train via Offenburg, Deutsche Bahn, which is 8.6 kilometers from Strasbourg only, and from separately, right, I can get it for just over 70 euros. If I ask Deutsche Bahn for it all together, they charge me 166 euros, right? Now, what's going on here is basically the way the tariffs are combined, doesn't work for the cross train, and it's actually even run by the Land of Baden-Württemberg. Yeah? Strasbourg is not a stop in the Baden-Württemberg tariff system, and therefore you end up with this absurdity. Now, the situation is such, and there are whole communities solving these types of problems online that will tell you all of these tricks, right? How do you split your ticket or find a way means around? But you shouldn't need to know all of those tricks in order to manage to get a decent ticket price from Berlin to Strasbourg, right? I contacted the Baden-Württemberg Travel Authority about this, and they said, yes, we know. And I was like, yeah, so what are you going to do about it? And then nothing happened. Entrepreneurs in Sweden are trying to solve some of these problems. All Aboard and Railtech, and they're trying to do it in slightly different ways. All Aboard is more like a kind of sustainable travel agency. They'll help you plan a really nice trip for your holidays. And Railtech is trying to be more like a kind of a kayak, or is basically, in summary, The cross-border connections are either in infrastructure and indeed service terms, either excellent already, right? The Öresund Bridge is one of the best international rail lines there is going, even though reliability has suffered a little bit in recent times. Or awful and complex, right? So those are the lines from Göteborg to Oslo and from Stockholm to Oslo. So via Kungsör is the one from Göteborg and via Charlottenberg is the one from Stockholm. Both of these railway lines are slow because they are wide Norwegian side of the border, and international rail is of no priority for the Norwegian government, right? Now the services, at least from Stockholm, are run by SJ, and it puts its oldest intercities on the route going to Oslo, whereas Stockholm to Göteborg is exactly the same distance as Stockholm to Oslo, right? But the train is older, the maximum speed is lower, the numbers of trains a day is much lower, yeah? And basically you feel like Sweden has not paid attention to at least make sure that the reasonable trains are put on the international route. And then there are two others which are really being improved. They're Storlien, so that would be from Trondheim, or there will be trains from Finland that will cross the bridge to Haparanda, and you'll be able to change them to a Swedish train. So that will allow you to, it will basically be Rovaniemi and Oulu will have connections to night trains then through to Sweden. So that's the situation. So ultimately, it's not, I haven't included Swedish borders in my top 20, not because all is good, but because the ones that really need fixing are really, really difficult to improve and really, really difficult to fix. And I wanted something where I had some hope that things would change. Services. And so therefore I want to make that kind of change of mentality, particularly from the European Commission. There are simple solutions for many of these problems, and to try to basically focus on those. The things which I'm then doing, so from the German national radio station this morning, and they'll...
When you cross the border by train in Europe, everything gets harder than when you stay within one country. In the summer of 2022, I, John Worth, put all of this to the test with the cross-border rail project. I crossed every internal border of the EU you can cross by train. That was 95 borders in total. I travelled more than 30,000 kilometres on the railways, and where trains do not run any longer, I took to my folding bicycle. And the rest was by bus, ferry and taxi. What did I find? In some places, rail lines have fallen into disrepair and would need to be rebuilt. But many of these are hard or expensive to fix, even if, like at Canfranc, the structure and the trains for these services exist.
But like to emphasize what I actually think is the root cause of the failure of the political systems to actually solve the policy questions. And that is that most of the politicians perceive railways as something that you do locally, regionally, and at best nationally. That you don't consider railways as a method of travel for cross-border. There are, of course, some exceptions to this, traveling daily across these borders. But other than those specific examples, we do not perceive railways as the sort of natural way of travel. And most politicians view the car, but more specifically aviation, as the most politicians don't try to solve this, they try to solve other societal problems. But given climate change, and given the difficulties that we have for decarbonization of aviation, but also longer distances, that mental shift in infrastructure, it's the market conditions for operators, and it's the regulatory framework governing those transports. And if you begin with investor, working on transport policy in Stockholm, your frame of mind is so it's not the fault of the individual politician, it's how the scope works. And then I started to become a national transport politician, and then me and most of my colleagues, you sort of naturally tend to think about, until I became a European transport policy person, that you really start to think about, well, you need, that's the scope of the European transport policy. But almost all of my colleagues in the European Transport Committee, when I was a national transport politician, most of my colleagues, when you think about transport policy, that's the frame of mind. And most politicians, regardless of where in Sweden you're from, or where in Finland or Spain or Italy, where you're from, you usually tend to, that's why we're spending in Sweden, for example, 10 billion euros or 100 billion Swedish krona on building new highways within Stockholm. It's the national budget would spend more money on trying to make it easier to travel from Stockholm to Oslo, for example. But you don't do it on the investments money is in the national level. And because of the nature of and trying to put more focus on cross-border. Second is the market conditions. I traveled here to Berlin through Hamburg on the new night train from Stockholm to Hamburg, and that's was a lovely trip. However, it's quite sad that we only have one day. We used to have a lot. In the 80s and early 90s, you could step on a night with a strong climate pricing on aviation and use those revenues to fund those investments that I talked about. The cross-border infrastructure on the European level, that does not necessarily mean that we need to reduce the national investment budgets. We can increase the European budgets through the financing of the climate pricing. But neither, even if we have more infrastructure, book that the most fun thing to tell your kids that they have to go look for an hotel and then buy new tickets. It's really expensive. And most families won't dare to make that choice unless they are certain that if they buy that ticket, they will end up in the destination with certainty. So if the first to try this adventure, but also non-enthusiasts. To and from the capital, but European budgets for cross-border railways. It's the market conditions or that you end up in your destination. Thank you very much. And now, John, if you want to join me up here,
Right.
and maybe we have some questions here.
Since you did, I was just curious to hear what I, as a
Only in the European Parliament, but also in the European Commission and also at national level politicians, is they don't understand the practical reality on the ground. They do not have these postcards, literal paper postcards this time. I used to have a series on my blog which was called Electronic Postcards to the Transport Commission. It would be, Dear Adina Valiant, today. And so that to me is the way of making that matter, right? I'm stuck here, I needed to buy another ticket, right? Now, I even had an action which I thought it would be quite funny if everyone sent a copy of all of their extra bills for missed trains and sent them all to the European Commission and demanded the European Commission reimburse them if the railway companies would not reimburse them, right? Something, anything you can do to make that everyday reality clear to those people making those decisions, right? Like, that's the only you or me. Okay, I don't know quite what you mean by that, but anyway, let's take that as given, right? To basically say, what's our life like, right, when we try and do this, and try and make decision makers. And what I've also tried to do, and again, this is an open invitation, particularly via Twitter, which is the best tool for solving this, is there are incredible people who will help you solve any practical problem in railways. If you want to get from A to B anywhere, we wish the railways would fix it, but Twitter users will fix it, right? They will help you work out how the hell to get a ticket for Euskotren or whatever, right? Now, so what you can then do at a practical level rather than a political level is basically say, hey, to friends of yours, hey, don't give up on this, right? I know some people who will help you get to your destination and pass that on in a kind of a grassroots kind of a way, you know? And so those are the things, and also back the good people, right? Back the good companies, right? Like, it sounds kind of insane, but which are the railway companies that were open to me in my project? The ones that are already good, the state-run ones, right? I have contact with some of the private ones as well, but the 3 state railways that wanted to meet me during my project. So I'm aware that's not a full answer, right? But for me, the personal experience is political. And if I can try and tell those stories, and you can tell those stories, a rail passengers association or a rail passengers lobby, what we've not got is anyone that does that internationally, right? And that's ultimately why I came up with this project, was to basically go, well, if no one else is doing this, well, why don't I ever go, right? I'm lucky enough that via my blog has enough readers to mean my blog readers then finance the project, right? Now, that then gives me an opportunity to then potentially Just the problem is there's no one really properly systematizing that or collecting that up at European level. Now, medium term, I'm not really super keen to move to Brussels right now, but medium term, it would be nice to build such an association in Brussels to try to do exactly that.
I have a question or pondering. I thought it was very interesting about that there isn't a system for reimbursing, for example, if you miss a train. However, in my small experience, when I've been going through between Sweden and Germany now during the pandemic, and I've gone through Denmark, and I've been on those trains, and I missed a train in Hamburg, so I've done that a zillion times, but I am reimbursed. They organize it for me every time, so I wonder maybe that's just Germany, and maybe the problem is that other countries don't follow. So if you would go to Italy, then you would get stuck in Munich, for example, and have to pay for a new ticket there.
Yeah.
Is there any truth in that?
Yes.
Or yeah.
So the Deutsche Bahn is one of the better ones of being able to provide tickets from Germany to Germany's neighbours. And even though you actually have to go through Denmark, Sweden is still in the system. So you can book in one ticket Germany to pretty much any station in Sweden, although not involving the night trains. So you need to basically use an extra 2 from Copenhagen or from Malmö through to Stockholm. But or in some other countries, right? So a trip I'm making next week going from Germany to rural Burgundy in France, so only going to one neighbouring country, Deutsche Bahn can only do that for about 20 French stations, right? Whereas it can do it for more or less the whole of Sweden. So actually, Germany, Denmark, Sweden is actually one of the better ones, right? It's particularly when you get to France and then you get further to Spain, or you get further towards southeastern Europe is when it particularly breaks down. Poland is also a bit difficult from Germany if you're outside of major cities. So yeah, you're completely correct, but you're lucky that Sweden to Germany is not one of the worst ones.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And to give more explanation to the example that I made, that this, what John says, is only when you've booked it through the same vendor.
Yeah.
If you book the trip from, let's say, Uppsala to Köpenhamn with SJ, and then as a separate purchasing decision from Köpenhamn to Hamburg with Danish DSB, and then the night train from Hamburg to Innsbruck with ÖBB, it covers the expense of the Danish part, but not the consecutive, because that might have been separate purchasing decisions. And in some instances, you might be able to book the entire inclusive journey as one purchase, and then of course you have that right, but you don't always have that opportunity to book that as a single purchasing decision.
And at the margin, if you use a platform like Trainline, for example, which is the kind of closest there is to a kind of Skyscanner for rail, they will sell you the tickets in one transaction, but you actually get multiple tickets. So even if it's one booking transaction, there are actually multiple separate tickets, which means you can still get stuck and have to buy another ticket, which they're not always completely honest and truthful about. Deutsche Bahn in that regard is better, because basically if you can book it off regular Deutsche Bahn, that means you get one ticket and you're fine. If Deutsche Bahn forwards you and the URL in your website changes to International Bahn, that means you might end up getting multiple tickets. And that's the way means of knowing are you safe or not. Now, my ultimate solution here would not be to oblige you to have one ticket between across the entirety of Europe. It is too complicated to be able to book from Haparanda to Lisbon involving 10 trains, right? Like, even airlines never do that, right? Airlines basically will book you a maximum of 3 planes. A short haul, a long haul, and a short haul. That's all they'll do, right? Now, the complexity of railways is you can quite easily end up with 4 or 5 or 6 trains for a long trip. So expecting a vendor to sell you one ticket for 6 trains altogether, that's not happening. What you need to have is a kind of delay guarantee.
No question.
Yep, no. Okay, we have some more in here.
Huh?
Yeah, I was doing Interrail this summer, and after 2 hours the train from Berlin to Köln was delayed because they had to take another way. And so we had seat tickets, and we were supposed to go to Brussels and then Lyon. So we missed all of that, and we missed the hostel night in Lyon. And then was also it's hard to get the money back. We went to the station and no, it's not Deutsche Bahn, blah, blah, blah. So, and we had Interrail, so we can just, we find another way to Geneva instead, so it was okay for us. But I mean, interrailing is funny and it's simple in many ways, and I was thinking, how is it with interrailing and getting money back? And because it's another way of traveling, of course. But I mean, it is about seat tickets sometimes. I try to take trips without the seat tickets, but sometimes you need them, and that's a problem. And also in Spain, you have to go to the tickets place in Spain to buy the ticket, and if you're lucky, you still have the tickets. So some interrail discussion.
So I've now amassed a lot of Interrail experience this summer, having been to pretty much every country you can use Interrail in. And I actually haven't yet done that, you've just reminded me. I haven't sought a reimbursement for a very expensive reservation for the Madrid to Marseille train that I couldn't take. I had a reservation for that train from Deutsche Bahn, which allowed me to reserve an international Spanish train, but they can't reserve me a national Spanish train. No idea. But so I had a Deutsche Bahn reservation for a Spanish train rather than trains that anyone can just get on. And the second is, what happens if you have no alternative to a high-speed train? Right now, in Germany, if your ICE doesn't run, you've normally got an intercity, or if you need it, a Regional Express. In Italy, it's the same. If your Frecciarossa doesn't run, there's an intercity, a regional, there's some other way of getting there. In France or in Spain, if your TGV or your AVE train doesn't run, there is nothing else. And those trains are compulsory reservation, and particularly in Spain, on some of the high-speed lines, they run twice a day. Right? There was one I needed to take from Zaragoza to Vigo. It runs once a day, and the train is booked up 2 weeks ahead. So how do you do that on Interrail? Right? Now, exactly the same problem that you faced. Had to find someone in Zaragoza who's a friend of a friend who went to the station for me, booked the ticket for me on paper, and I picked it up from the guy when I was in Zaragoza. This is insane. Now, why is that? Interrail is owned by the state-owned railway companies, right? So the company that runs Interrail based in Utrecht is owned by the likes of SNCF and Renfe and Deutsche Bahn and so on. And those two in particular, SNCF and Renfe, hate Interrail. They would happily get rid of it completely if they could. And so therefore, you can buy any ticket for a Renfe train online, including a reservation for your pet, but you can't buy an Interrail reservation. Why? They want us for you Interrail. Also, really, really important, politically, right, which is much, much more important than actually that for Interrail. It boils down to, what is a railway network actually for? And can you integrate rail into your everyday life in a reasonable way, right? Now, imagine tomorrow, someone in your family lives in Freiburg, the other end of Germany, and you need to get there tomorrow, right? Will Deutsche Bahn get you to Freiburg tomorrow? Sure, right? It might be pretty expensive. You might have to stand, right, if the train is full, but it will get you there. Now, if you lived in Paris and you need to get to Marseille tomorrow, will French railways actually literally get you there? Or if you live in Zaragoza and you need to go to Vigo? The answer to that is, it's not certain, right? They will basically go, train is booked up, tough shit, right? Now, that basic issue, which is, if my life changes, can the railway cope, right? German railways can cope, Austrian railways can cope, Swedish railways can mostly cope, or if an X2000 is booked up, then you're often left without options. But there can be sometimes, you can sometimes take 2 regional trains-ish, yeah? And then also, in regional trains, what happens if something changes, right? Imagine you live in Cottbus outside of Berlin, and you work in Berlin. And suddenly your kid at school is ill, and you need to get back to Cottbus, like now, right? Now, Deutsche Bahn would get you back to Cottbus now, right? In Sweden, if you live in Örebro or Västerås or something, you can get back to Stockholm now or within 1 hour, right? If you're in rural France or in rural Spain, where the train runs 3 times a day, you can't, right? You might be left waiting 5 hours, even if your trip is only 1 hour, right? Now, that basically means, and that is reflected in Interrail. So basically, Spain and France have created what I kind of call two-class railway systems. Basically, the long-distance ones are for people who also own cars, and they generally are for things which are for one-off trips. It's not something you do on an everyday basis. And that's why in France you have these railway stations in the middle of the countryside on a high-speed line somewhere. They call them the Gare des Betteraves, the beetroot stations, which are basically in the middle of nowhere because you would drive there. And then the regional trains, they only basically exist for people who've got no other alternative. The people who are either too poor or too young to be able to have a car. And that, as a kind of a structure of your railway, in my view, is completely wrong. Right? Now, give me the Czech railway system over the French railway system, Interrail, right? That's also then the reason why they want to make Interrail hard, is because they want to fill up every last compulsory reserved seat and fill it up for a pretty expensive price. Yeah.
I have one more question. You probably answered it to me before, but I forgot. This obsession with investing into infrastructure rather than services. Maybe Jakop can say something about that. Where is that coming from? Because that was my first reaction when John first told me about the situation between France and Spain, where they're investing millions into really expensive high-speed infrastructure, and you have 2 or 3 trains a day. How come there is not a compulsory service that has to also be delivered when you get that kind of money? How can it be that the European Union is spending a lot of money in Baltic states, but there's no trains running there? Like these kind of things. Maybe you can shed some light on where that's coming from, and do you think it's going to change given the climate change situation and the pressure, maybe also the conscience of people wanting to travel?
So there is a tendency for those big investment decisions that are taken might not always to spend more on the prestigious projects and less on the missing links that will actually provide a far better societal benefit per euro, but doesn't get you any public attention, because it's too, if you spread it out on 100 projects, yes, you get some local paper there, some local TV station there, but it doesn't build your political persona. But these big projects do, and that's part of the fundamental problem, I would say.
But I mean, if you spend that much money on a high-speed connection, I mean, they get the money and they have plans to make a service, but then those plans just don't materialize, and there is no consequences, it seems.
But the EU is saying, so the worst of all, we haven't really particularly mentioned, is the high-speed line between Figueres in Catalonia and Perpignan. So it would form part of a Paris to Barcelona route. It has 2 trains a day each way year-round, and only 4 trains a day in the summertime. And however, France runs at least 5 trains a day from Paris the whole way to Perpignan, and there's a train every 2 hours from Figueres on the Spanish side through to Poland. It's not because of the German federal government, it's because Brandenburg and Berlin want better connections to Stettin. Right now, it's not brilliant, don't get me wrong, the trains are not super high speed, but they're steady improvements, not because of Germany and Poland, but because of the regions either side of the border. Now finally, for that one, for France and Spain, the regions are getting interested. But at the moment, there's just no legal framework. There's no one you can take to court to go, hey, why are you running so few trains?
I can also add that politicians to answer questions on this, and to be very frank, there are not that many politicians that are as literate on how this actually works as John is, for example.
Or as you are in the Europe, and now I'm not really convinced by the current Liberal incumbent. Transport minister was not a job you really wanted in the German government. And I don't really think that transport commissioner is really a job that most possible commissioners really want in the future either. And I think the current incumbent of the European Commissioner for Transport it's not that she's pro-transport commissioner portfolio, who are we going to give it to, and ended up being given to her. And so you've not got politicians in the commission who've been able to really move it from that side, and the legislative initiative in the EU, after all, lies with them rather than with the European Parliament.
Isn't that going to change now with climate change becoming so obvious to everyone and transport being such a important part of
I mean,
solving that?
that's really the only hope, is that there is a societal movement, both booking more railway tickets, sending that signal to the railway companies that only catering to the domestic travel is not the future, but also catering to cross-border. That will change the mindset of the operators, and if you create that electorate and try to make it politically interesting for other politicians, not only, I mean, I'm into this because I think it makes sense politically, but I also do it out of self-interest. Because I've been interrailing since I was a kid, and it's so frustrating to some extent see it deteriorating during my lifetime. It was easier to go interrailing when I was younger, and now it's becoming more difficult. And I'm frustrated by it, and I want to solve it, if nothing else, just for myself. But if it would be easier to get elected and to get a lot of votes, then more politicians who don't go by train themselves might care about it. So I'm not saying you go fix it, not me, but if more people would vote out of transport policy and about politicians caring about it, that might go a long way.
To me, an interesting point behind the scenes learning from this project is also the mentality in the different railway companies, right? And it's not, and also when we talk about kind of public enterprise, public companies versus private companies in this, I've seen everything through this project. Really good state operators, really bad ones. Really good private ones, really bad ones. A setup of a liberalised railway, and I'm afraid would be better because you've got a reliable central information source. So you've got, if you look for it, really good examples in different places in Europe where this stuff really functions, and there's been major steps forward, right? The best step forward, right, sounds absurd. Where's the biggest step forward in cross-border rail in 2021 in the EU, right? I leave you guessing for 10 minutes in the room and you'd never find out where it was. It is between Miskolc in eastern Hungary and Košice in eastern Slovakia, which went from 1 train a day to 7 trains a day on the cross-border line, right? This is cool, right? Now, if some part of comparatively poor 2 industrial cities in eastern Hungary and Slovakia can manage to make this stuff work, right? You had a decent relationship between the 2 railways on both sides. The Hungarians discovered that actually they didn't need any more trains to turn around the trains in Košice rather than the last town on the Hungarian side. Nice and simple, everything functions, right? The train is pretty basic, it would never win any prize for kind of the most deluxe, brilliant train, right? But it matches what is needed there on the ground, right? Now, and so if you look for that, right, you've got really interesting examples where if you've got like the right political will, the right operational mindset, you can fix these things. And that's what you've got to get kind of those incentives lined up in the right way and have railway executives that have generally the right approach. Now, I keep on coming back to this. The most healthy, in my view, state-run railway that there is the Austrian Railways ÖBB, not least because the chief executive and all of his management team practice what they preach. You gain the impression they actually like running a railway and like taking trains. And they will do it and will run services, they won't make a loss out of them, but they want to run more trains for more people. Now, I don't gain the impression that SNCF really has anyone in its management team that wants to give the impression that they want to run more trains for more people. Right? And that's kind of completely the other end of the spectrum. How the hell you change that in the management structure? Maybe we need to all lobby Clément Beaune, the new transport minister in France, who's a former Europe minister. Right now, if he can't manage to crack it, then I don't know who really can.
Well, we talked a lot of infrastructure and politicians and data. What about the people, the onboard staff? What was your experience during the trip? Did they help you if there's any problem? Or?
That varied. Let's also, but the trains as well a second before we come to the staff. regional trains across Europe have improved so much, right? There were only 2 regional trains in the entire time which were so old they were not disabled compatible and didn't convey bicycles. One in Portugal and one in Poland. Right now, the problem with the stations and whether literally you could get with a person of reduced mobility or with a bicycle. But the trains themselves have improved enormously for regional services. Long distance is a bit more complicated. The staff, I must say, don't take this the wrong way, but I try and avoid staff, right? And to me, there was an interesting question of basically how or when do you even need to deal with staff? Now, in my view, for me as a highly knowledgeable and digitally aware person in railways, I shouldn't actually need to talk to any staff at all, because the app should tell me there were thousands of people because they were all queuing at the ticket office trying to get information because they couldn't get it any other way. Now, I did have some really good hay, which meant it made it even more difficult. And all the passengers, they just stood there, right? Now, staff could help facilitate those sorts of problems, right? Can we all organize this a bit better so it's a bit less inconvenient for people? Doesn't really work. And there are a couple of railways, particularly Romania, but to a certain extent Croatia, where I just generally feel that the staff have given up, right? That there was a kind of understand it, because if you look how poorly paid they are, right? Maybe they're just like, well, this is just our job. But at the point at which the staff have lost hope in it, right? That's when a railway has really crossed into a very difficult spot. And I get that impression a bit in railways in Croatia as well. And so the three countries which make me really sad, right, are Romania, Croatia, and Latvia for different ways, right? Where taking the train is just also the level of maintenance, right? Like, I'm not a railway engineer, but I can really see that they haven't even done the basics right on Romanian railways, right? You see flashstellen on the tracks, right, that you're then crossing. You can't respect the timetable just because, like, there are so many speed restrictions on the network. Like, even if everything else runs to plan, it will never respect the timetable. So you, by definition, will miss your connections. And when you see that, that just makes you really, really sad. And so that was quite difficult. But I'm really interested in the kind of digitization staff thing, right? How can a railway provide good enough information to make sure I don't actually have to talk to a person, because railways are short of people, so as to then mean I can deploy the people for the purposes and the places where I really need them, right? Like, the live running data from Trenitalia, it's brilliant, right? Like, in the notifications you get on your phone to keep you updated on what's going on, like, top, right? That basically means I'm completely informed without even having to speak to someone, right? Now, there are some people in railways who will go, we don't like that, right? That's too depersonalized, right? But if those people that are happy to have that information digitally mean actually the person that does need to speak to a human can actually get to one without queuing for an hour, then I'm cool with it. So I haven't really fully unpicked those things. Those are kind of ideas in my head. Or design, interior design of trains. What makes a really good interior design of trains? I've seen everything on this trip, right? Like, good, bad, indifferent, right? Bad placing of seats, good design of toilets, overhead racks, bicycle racks, all kinds, right? And from all kinds of different manufacturers, right? Some good, bad, and indifferent. Loads of really interesting thinking about that's still just kind of floating in my head and I haven't actually written down yet.
Isn't always the answer to everything. There are many parts of our society that should be governed by public bodies, by common decisions. However, there are some parts of Europe where the state-owned railway does not seem to be run by people who themselves care too much about the railways actually working, and there's not too much pressure from the politics on that railway company to be as effective as it can, and there's no competition, so it's like a sort of a guarded enterprise, in that the person running the company earns their salary regardless if the service functions or not. And the lack of competition doesn't seem that seems to translate into laziness. So that doesn't necessarily mean that one should be in favor of more privatization and more competitiveness. But if you look at Sweden, for example, the entrance of MTR on the railway between Stockholm and Göteborg has brought down.
Controlled by SNCF, so it operates like a monopoly, but it has to be cost returning, so it behaves like a private sector capitalist. So you have no competition and you have private type incentives, and you end up with no competition and sky high prices, which is a horrible mess. So yeah, but you've got to make sure you've got to do it in the right way if you introduce competition on your railways. Now, for me, Sweden has got good outcomes in terms of the quality of the service, but it's let down by the reliability of the information. Now, because I had a situation where a train was going to be cancelled, neither the night train operator, which is actually the Norwegian state railways running the night train to northern Sweden, nor SJ that runs the daytime trains, knew whether there would be a rail replacement bus service. And they said it's Trafikverket, the network operator, that will run the bus. We're like, hang on a minute, how am I going to get information out of them, right? And they were passing the ball between each other. Now, if you've got to make sure that you have authoritative information if you have multiple operators. And to me, that's the biggest weakness of Swedish railways, is that bit. And I would say that from a non-Swede using the network, it makes Swedish railways one of the hardest to use. As a Swede, maybe you know all of those tricks, right? But as a non-Swede, I find